see last.
Yeah.
From what I heard, we got a couple pretty good, I think 2 or 3 teams that have only lost 1 or 2 games.
They've only lost
You ready?
Got a minute.
He says it's ready.
Oh, he said he's ready? I'm not
He's ready. Thumbs up.
That is. If I can have your attention, it's 5:30. We'll go ahead and start the January 8th, 2019 Planning and Zoning Commission to order. You should have received the posted and printed agenda. Any changes proposed for that? If not, we'll proceed with that as posted. First item is to approve the minutes. Any corrections or changes to the minutes? If not, I'll approve those as printed and distributed. Second item of business is report on city council actions. We had one that was listed and we had some that were verbal from last night. So James, if you could bring us up to date on those.
Sure, thank you. We had on December 17th of 2018, we had a city council conducted the final reading of an ordinance that would that was a request for the city of Rolla to amend Article 3 of Chapter 42, which is known as the Rolla Planning and Zoning Code, by deleting and adding language to Division 18 of said article, which is known as signs, for the particular purpose of permitting temporary and portable signage. There were 3 amendments made to this ordinance. One of them was that vacant lots in residential areas would receive the same sign permissions as a single-family home. Vacant lots in non-residential districts are permitted an unlimited amount of freestanding signs only if the total sign area does not exceed 96 square feet. And there was we deleted an exemption for decorations up to 120 days. Last night, on January 7th of 2019, there were 3 cases that were approved without conditions pertaining to RCDC Properties, which is the Rolla Community Development Corporation. One of those ordinances that passed was an ordinance approving the vacation of a utility easement being a fractional part of the south half of Lot 1 of the northwest quarter of Section 30, Township 38 North, Range 7 West of the 5th PM, Rolla, Phelps County, Missouri. That actually didn't go to the Planning and Zoning Commission, but it's related to the subdivision and the annexation, which was also passed last night on January 7th, 2019. One of those ordinances was a request to subdivide Lot 5 and Lot 6 of the final plat of High Point West Number 1 into 4 new lots, and the name of that new subdivision is High Point West Number 2. That was approved. Also last night, the ordinance was a request that approved a request for the city of Rolla to annex the 1.68 acre parcel identified with the Phelps County Assessor's account number of 3356.03 and to simultaneously designate the zoning of said parcel as the heavy manufacturing district M2 was also approved, and that was the applicant was RCDC as well. And that was all.
Any questions for James on city council action? You actually made the sign, we didn't take our advice the last time, you actually made the sign ordinance worse than it was second time. That's my humble opinion. Maybe hope, though, they finally took down the 4x8 sign at the corner of my street this week, so, political signs. So, we have no public hearings. We have one item of old business. As you recall, last month we probably needed more direction, so we set aside the Article 3 of Chapter 42 revisions. So it's a request to insert a new division into Article 3 of Chapter 42, which is known as the Planning and Zoning Code, and for this code to be known as Division 22, Wireless Communications. I thought Section 18 was terrible, but I think 22 is even worse. It's a 17-page ordinance, so without further ado, we'll bring it back up, and Mr. Shields.
All right, thank you. Speaking of that ordinance, there was a law firm, and Joseph E. Bond is here from that law firm of Cunningham, Vogel, and Roast, who actually wrote the ordinance. We also did a few minor revisions. So So he'll be here to explain, to answer any questions you have, and give an overview also. And since I already gave an overview of this proposal last time, I'm just going to quickly go over refreshing your memories. And so these are these towers. They're good at long range. They have a long range, and they're good for radio waves that transfer voice messages. These are design support structures. These have to do with small wireless facilities, and so you can hide the actual antenna and camouflage it into the landscape. Small wireless facilities have a shorter range, but they're better at transferring data because there's less interference. So anytime we talk about small cell or small wireless facilities, these are a few examples of those. So just to give you a little something to think, to put in your minds when you're hearing about these facilities. So in order to facilitate small cell deployment, state and federal governments have enacted laws that will prevent localities from making it too difficult, timely, or costly to deploy such technology. But at the same time, local governments have been tasked with preventing that same technology from affecting their neighborhood character and property values. And so what Division 22 is attempting to do is to control and limit the proliferation of these so that they don't affect our community and the property values and the character of our neighborhood. Just real quickly, the two significant bills that are causing these, creating these preemptions of our ability to control these types of facilities is SB 650 and HB 1991. HB 1991 attempts to accomplish this goal of ensuring their deployment, to facilitate their deployment by streamlining regulations to access right-of-way and city poles, capping cost and fees, and speeding up timelines for consideration and processing of small cell siting applications. And as you remember, we zoned a lot of the right-of-way that had to do with this upcoming Division 22. So HB 1991 preempts certain zoning authority over small cell deployment, as I've already said. And lastly, as part of satisfying, so HB 1991 required that shortly after the enactment of HB 1991 that all cities adopt an ordinance or development agreement that makes available to wireless providers rate, fees, and other terms that comply with the new law. So this, as part of satisfying this requirement, the City of Rolla proposes to insert Division 22 into the zoning ordinance tonight. And just to break it down, this is kind of just how, this is how it basically, sorry, this is this is kind of a diagram of the levels of review. Over here is permitted uses. So this is the preemptions. A lot of this has to do with the preemptions. So state law says that any one of these four basically are preempted, and you don't need zoning approval. It just goes straight to building review. Now, if it's over here, if it either doesn't meet it also has to meet general requirements. If it doesn't meet general requirements or cannot be classified as a permitted use, it's either administrative approval if it meets any of the two provisions under disguised support structure or fast track small wireless facility, or if it doesn't meet general requirements or does not meet or does not fall under disguised support structure or fast track small wires facility, it's a conditional use permit. So there was, we can go, I'll let him, if you have any questions about the general requirements, we can talk about that, but I went over it last time. There was one last thing, we had a meeting about an hour ago, and we did notice one little amendment that we are going to suggest we put in there before we send it to City Council, and it has to do with the historical, the 30-day historical waiting period. So if one of these wireless facilities want to be put on a historical structure, then there has to be a 30-day waiting period and a public hearing. So there was just a little line at the last sentence in that provision. It mentions historical districts, but it doesn't also mention historical structures. So there's a difference between a historical. You can have an historical structure that's not in a historical district. So we just wanted to add that the city can do this, and this for any structures within a historical district or a structural or a historical structure, a certified historical structure, not in a historical district. So I just wanted to mention that, but I didn't want to rehash everything we went over last time, and I wanted to let you get enough time with Joseph Bond, who'll be open up to questions after you ask me any questions if you have any. And so no protest petitions or official comments have been filed to this department by the public, but there was a memo from the Rolla Municipal Utilities, and that could be found in Figure 5 of your packet. So the action required from the Planning and Zoning Commission is to recommend the denial, approval, or conditional approval of the City of Rolla's proposal to insert Division 22 into the Rolla Planning and Zoning Code. And that's it.
Any questions for James before we move on? I don't think we have any historical districts. We have some historical structures, such as the courthouse, the old courthouse.
That's
And
correct.
some other,
Phelps County Bank.
unfortunately, most of the,
Phelps County Bank.
Phelps County Bank's
That,
another one.
that shingle style house on the
But I don't, they tried to organize the district, and I don't think it ever materialized.
no, we have a commission, but I don't think they meet.
I don't think so either. Any other comments or questions from Mr. Shields?
Where does RMU stand on all this? I mean, I know we have the memo,
There-
but
Yes, we've had, so there was, they got the that AT&T, that revised comment memo, right about the same time you all did.
right.
And so they did a quick read over it, and so after reading it again and clarifying some things, I won't, Chad Davis is here, I'm sure he could speak to it, but we've resolved most of the issues. If there are any other issues, they're very minor, and I think
that's a big reason why we pushed it back to today, was so that RMU have more sufficient time to review it. And so
Mhm.
I hope that that's happened. And
yeah. Do you want to go ahead and? Sure.
Chad Davis, Operations Manager at RMU, and as noted in the memo, the quick review of it was, we made some errors in that review in terms of how the definition of right-of-way was described, overlooked the fact that some of those that I was worried about last time were an exception, that's not part of the right-of-way definition. And I attended the meeting that James referenced earlier, and we've had a couple of other meetings subsequent with the city, and even before the last P&Z meeting last month. So the city, we've been trying to work together and trying to come up with solutions that work well. As Joe will talk about too, I think there's such complexity with all of this, but I think generally the way it's written right now from RMU's perspective is before a permit is granted by the city, that applicant has to receive consent of the pole owner, in this case RMU or any other pole owners too. So that would be part of the process that the city would go through. So it would be at that point, through that process, RMU would be negotiating a third-party agreement with those attaching entities to put equipment on our poles. So that would be really where the crux of our work comes into play, as to whether or not we can put an agreement in place that makes it manageable from our perspective on our poles. And then from a consent portion, then the city would be looking at it, that we've got an agreement in place, and go from there. If they locate on RMU poles.
what do you see as any major problems putting these on RMU poles?
The biggest issue that we've had with this, and historically, not just in the last few months as this being developed, but even over many years, some of the legislation that enacted these a number of years ago, I know, as that was going through the legislative process and didn't pass in different forms. As an industry, and even as Rolla specific and myself personally, we've been active in that effort to try to control how they're deployed, and putting the telecommunications equipment in what we call the electric space, the top portion of the pole, and whether or not the people that would be working in those spaces, the telecom providers, the contractors, et cetera, would be qualified to work in that live electric environment. Because generally how they install these facilities is to put the antenna at the very top of the pole, to put the equipment lower down. So you got to have wiring and conduit to go from the bottom to the top of the pole, and that's got to go through the electric space. That's the huge concern. And then also on ancillary to that is some of the pictures that James has shown you, is some of the size of some of the equipment and how that stresses the poles and potentially causes more impacts.
So is this going to be something when these things start getting installed where RMU is going to have to be called out to assist in the installation or the maintenance if it's in the electric space, or is that something that like AT&T
What we've
can do?
envisioned with some of the potential providers that we've had some preliminary talks with is setting individual poles for these facilities so that way they don't have to worry about that space. And have these for just dedicated facilities for just that equipment, and then there's less worry. Now that may or may not work in some cases. In other cases where if we can come up to an agreement that makes sense to put them on poles that have electric facilities on them, one option is to try to limit it to the just secondary voltage. That's where we have some of those we have some attachments now, and those providers aren't working in the primary space. The other potential that we could come up with an agreement, if we can gain confidence level with that third party, is to allow them to put it in that upper space on the pole, that top space on the pole, if either whether we do the work and charge them for those in part of the attachment as part of the agreement process, or they do it on their own with staff that's capable of handling that work. So I wish I knew the exact answer on how that would work, Matt, but that'd be the process we'd have to work through to see if we come up with an agreement that works.
I know in the past with the CenturyLink and the poles that they use and the wire that they use on your poles hasn't been the best relationship, and they do a poor job of maintaining their equipment. And I have some concern that we're going to see a lot of the same thing with these, where they, unsightly poles that they're not maintaining, or they're using your poles and really not maintaining them the way they should be.
And I think that's been the intent of the industry, the Electric Utility Association, MPUA, PPA, folks like the city and Joe and his firm in trying to draft some of this legislation so that it's not an uncontrolled free-for-all, that everything can be done anyway. And that's, I know sitting in the meeting this afternoon, I think a number of us, every time we sit and talk about it, becomes more and more clear exactly how the process would work to try to make sure that doesn't happen. And that's why it turns into an 18 or 20 page long document, I think, and even a 6 or 8 page long application, just to be able to try to make sure that doesn't happen is the goal.
So seeing that this is likely going to happen, I think the legislature's made it clear that they're going to make us do this. Are you comfortable with the language we have now, or is there additional changes
I think what's
you'd
been
like?
proposed in terms of in terms of the codes and then also the right-of-way management perspective, I think is manageable for RMU, especially since if they desire to put attachments on RMU poles, they still have to come to RMU to work out a third-party pole attachment agreement or whatever we would call it. But they have to have an agreement with RMU directly for that attachment. That has to be part of their application to the city to show that they have consent to put those improvements on RMU poles. And that would be the same whether it's RMU poles, Ameren poles, Show Me, Intercounty Electric, Fidelity, or CenturyLink, or the university, any pole owner in town. They have to have that proof of consent that owner of that pole is allowing them to put it on that pole. Because the vast majority of poles in town are not owned by the city of Rolla itself. So, and this process would establish that requirement to provide that consent with the application.
If an applicant's request is denied, is there an appeal process? And if so, who does that?
I
don't know that.
Commissioner, I'd probably be best off to turn that one over to Joe and James.
Just curious how complicated this is going to get.
Before you leave,
Yes,
is there a possibility that more than one company, if you got a pole out here that is in a prime place, would more than one company use that pole?
We'd be open to that possibility. Some of that's going to be open also, or up to the discretion of the company as to whether or not they want to co-locate or not. I know we talked about it, and Joel, I'm sure, hit on it too, is that co-location used to be something that pole owners could mandate that they had to do. With changes in legislative over the last few years, that mandate is no longer available. So we would make that available to them if the conditions are right, but we can't require it. Is that right? Said right?
Yeah.
in the technology, they could use the same pole and wouldn't interfere with each other.
I can't say if it, I don't know for sure. I think so, but part of it also is how much structurally that pole we can adequately put on that pole and consider that too. But if the structural requirements can be met, interference requirements can be met by those entities putting it on the pole and the equipment that are deploying as a utility, if our pole can accommodate it, we'd be willing to have that discussion with them to allow that co-location.
Any other questions?
Do you read this as allowing attachment to your light poles as well as your electric poles, or is this just your electric poles?
The definition exempts out electric distribution poles, it puts the electric distribution poles under the control of RMU because they're for electric operations. Generally, the way we're looking at it is that would include streetlight poles that RMU operates.
Okay.
So we'll see where they want to try to site them.
But, we have a lot of, light poles that are aesthetic. They look nice, or look nice for a light pole, I guess.
Yeah.
You start attaching things to them that may detract from that. So like the
That's
light
where
poles
that-
downtown and light poles in certain neighborhoods.
Some of that then gets into where, I forget exactly how it's phrased, James and Joe will go into it too, I think, is the disguised facilities, so that way there is a path to, that before they're permitted to put it on, if it is an aesthetic pole or there's other specific reasons why, they're expected to make the improvements that blend in with those poles as opposed to standing out to them if they're special poles.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you.
Ian, thank you.
I don't know how many questions I answered. Yeah.
If there wasn't any more questions for me, I can just have
Yeah,
Joseph
please
come up.
have him come forward. We appreciate him sharing his expertise.
And I appreciate you all for having me here and giving me the opportunity to present this and to help clarify and streamline some of the concerns. I also want to apologize for it being so complicated, for it being, so long and, intricate. Part of that, I think you can blame Washington, D.C. Part of it, I think you can blame Jeff City. But I'm not here to point fingers. What we're wanting to do to go forward is to take what little authority that we still have and put it together in the best possible way to prevent a couple things. Clutter. We don't want there to be a bunch of additional poles. We already have a lot of poles in the city. Where we can use those for co-locations, we're going to use this code to try to encourage that, and I'll explain a little bit more of that later. And aesthetics. Aesthetics are very important. A lot of, you wouldn't think certain little street lights are really important, but when you start talking about having some of these spear guns on the back, or whatever you want to call them, it can get a little Mad Max pretty fast. So the overview of how this code will work is there's essentially 3 tracks. From permitted use, administrative, to conditional use. The permitted uses, as James said, are going to be places where we're preempted. There's nothing we can do about it. I wish that weren't the case, but the state legislature and the FCC are going to permit, things that could be to the size of refrigerators on certain poles. And that's why prior we had attempted to zone some of the right-of-way, which might have seemed like a silly proposition, but this was the idea that they left us, a path to still zone. So we're going to take that avenue and use what we can to still, maintain aesthetics. Also, in these permitted uses, you're going to see antennas on existing buildings or structures. That is intended to capture fraternal organizations, churches, that sort of thing. We'd like to see the antennas frankly, on those sorts of properties. They can help churches. They get revenue through having the antenna co-location, Elks Clubs, Lions Clubs, that sort of thing. So this is saying, hey, if you're going to go there, you're going to, essentially be providing a public service. It's going both ways, so we'll make it easier and permitted. Those are the two big permitted uses. Essentially, here's where we want to encourage it because it's pretty low impact on a high level, or we don't have any authority whatsoever. The administrative approval is going to be these disguises. I don't think there are a ton of cacti here in Rolla, but they can do some pretty creative designs that can really blend in. They don't blend in as much to me because I do a lot of the telecom stuff, so I can tell, oh, that's not a real tree. That's a, But that's one of the ideas is if they're willing to disguise it, and that disguise might even be a currently existing light pole. Oftentimes they'll have like a concrete stanchion at the bottom. If they can put some of that equipment in there, make it look concrete or make it look like a typical light pole, but it has a cabinet where they can access, that's fine. I think that's the kind of development that we would encourage. So those are disguised. The fast track is something that's slightly different. It has certain volumetric specs that are they're much smaller than the what would be permitted under the state law. And the idea there is we still have zoning authority. We're going to do it administratively. We're not going to allow it to be as big as the law would permit it because we don't have to, but we're still going to give you a certain cubic space that we've essentially determined is a fair amount based on some of these smaller installations that we've seen. Now we also excuse me, create a waiver provisions in there where administratively we can waive some of the volumetrics to say, okay, you can go a little bit bigger to make it work. Because in the end, we want this technology to come. It's coming regardless, and the more that we try to work collaboratively, the better outcome we're going to get. In the end, if we fight tooth and nail, I don't think it's going to turn out how we want it to, because look at how it's turned out so far. So the idea is that if we can work collaboratively and say, we'll do this administratively and we'll allow certain waivers where we're comfortable, then they won't have to go through some of the more onerous zoning procedures, which is where our conditional uses would trigger. If they say, no, we want to put this refrigerator-sized thing outside of, Miss Lewis's house where we still have zoning authority, then they're going to have to go through our zoning authority. And that's well within our rights, and frankly, we think, at least the city recommends, that that is something that we would want to preserve for our citizens. That's a long way of saying, I'm ready for any questions that you may have. But that's kind of the overview of what the ideas are, what we're working against, and what we're trying to kind of contort ourselves into the position where we can do the most possible. So,
have you been working with a number of entities?
Yeah, the city of Rolla has engaged our law firm and has worked in a group of other cities, and this is a model that we've used previously, prior to the small cell law being passed. Now that it's been passed, we've added parts of the model in to deal with that sort of the change in law. But since Rolla is a relatively new client of ours, the reason there are such wholesale changes are they're implementing a more full model of what we would have, whereas other cities in the group might have used a smaller aspect. But this is ordinances that have been proposed in other places, yes.
Technology changes so quick anymore. What's the chance of this being moot? I mean, they may come up with a way of sending signals that would make this go away. Is that?
I think that we would welcome that.
Yeah, I know, but is that?
I'm sorry, I don't mean to be glib.
Well, it's changed so much,
Sure.
Is this going to address any future? I mean, this addresses what we have now, but.
So the way this is designed is if the law changes where something that we're doing now becomes illegal, then it wouldn't apply itself. It kind of has a self clawback. But as to the technology, if I could pull back a little, we've always heard, 5G's around the bend, or 5G is going to be deployed in 2018. Well, it's 2019. If you read some industry reports, 5G might not necessarily be on, in the next 2 months, in the next 5 months. So we're trying to prepare for the rollout of the next big thing, which is this, rather than necessarily trying to anticipate technology that I couldn't, explain if it were,
Any other questions or comments from Mr. Board? Bond?
From a legal standpoint, what do you see as any potential challenges, or have there been any challenges to this this ordinance or ordinances like this?
There have not been challenges yet. This is kind of in the process of rolling these out. We have been in contact with some of the carriers, and they have seen kind of what we're doing. And in that regard, I don't think they like everything, and there might be some things they might challenge on the periphery, but we've built in, and the way we've sort of designed this is that if it's going to be a problem, we can waive certain provisions, or if it becomes clear to us that it's wholly inapplicable, then it kind of self-preempts, so we won't be enforcing that which is illegal. So we wouldn't provoke necessarily a lawsuit. Now, the FCC, they're trying to change some of the rules as well, and that's kind of a backdrop that's going on. Those rules haven't yet become effective, and even if they become effective, they're still being appealed. So rather than wait for the day that the FCC has had, run through the gamut of court, we're trying to get, what we can in front of us and try to regulate as we can.
What if any significant proposals has the FCC made that would impact this?
One purported change is to knock out kind of what Chad was talking about, where municipal utilities get to consent to use of their poles, that it would just say they don't get a separate exemption. They're kind of looped in with the city. That would be a pretty serious change. I don't want to tee up a ton of legal issues necessarily in open session.
I'm just curious what you foresee as potential problems down the road that, obviously we can't deal with them all today and
Mm-hmm.
probably shouldn't.
Sure.
Just so we know that a year from now we can expect when we get sued by AT&T or somebody, it's just like, okay, well, we saw this coming. It's not really a surprise.
So, I guess I think the best way to address that question is this ordinance and the one that's going through the right-of-way are kind of a way to set the playing field, to put us to where nobody's getting a special deal, and so that we can treat everybody the same. There's always claims of discrimination when it comes to treating different providers differently, and this is codifying our playing field to protect us from discrimination claims. So that's one avenue that this is helping protect. In terms of other things that could be challenged, we've made it so if the law says that we can't do it, we won't do it. So they're going to have to prove to us, and there's going to have to be, either a case or some binding authority that the city, accepts that would make what we're doing illegal, I guess is what I'm saying. I know that's kind of a circular answer, and I'm not trying to...
Well, I think, is it fair to say that this is our best guess of what we can anticipate would be a lawful ordinance to address these small cell wireless?
I think that is a more than fair thing to say.
You mentioned discrimination, and I'm curious, we talk about co-location, and that's basically, if I understand it correctly, that's where we would have multiple carriers attaching to a pole.
That is one definition, yeah. There's 2 different FCC definitions. There's a couple different state law definitions of what a co-location is. Without getting too into the weeds on that, there was a question of whether they would want to all be on one pole, whether what we would like to see with that. With the fast track, at least what we've drafted in here, is that ideally there would be one, let me make sure I'm getting this right, that there would, no, so we would allow multiple fast tracks to be located on one pole. As far as the technology goes, I think the tops of these poles is kind of the prime real estate. You call them cantennas. You probably have seen maybe one of these installations that are on top of these light poles. I think that's kind of the ideal spot to put one of these things. Whether they can have panel antennas as well and have 2 different carriers, I think is, I'm not an RF engineer, so I don't know if they interfere with each other, but if they want to go there and that's kind of a prime real estate, so long as it won't topple over, I think that's better than putting a new pole. In terms of discrimination, that's more, granting access to the right-of-way, charging equivalent fees, treating everybody the same. That's not to say that they all behave the same, but we're at least setting the rules for how everybody needs to behave.
So if we said like first come, first served to attach to these poles, that's not discrimination, that's a fair playing field.
So long as our reason for saying first come, first serve were based on something like this pole couldn't take another.
Like safety.
Exactly.
Okay.
That would be acceptable. If we're just sort of saying, we don't want it, that's closer. But this is always going to be couched in overloading these things and safety. We want the technology. We just want to make sure RMU can do its job. That it's not going to be super ugly in front of Miss Lewis's house, and that they're safe. That's why this is so long, because it kind of loops in a lot of that. So,
thank you.
Yeah.
I get the impression that when this is finally adopted and taken on, there's going to be a swamping of the system where just mega applications come in. Mm-hmm. Who takes care of those applications, and then once they're approved, who goes out and watches them do whatever they do?
So we, in the process of drafting these ordinances, we've also drafted some application documents and kind of been doing training with the staff so that Public Works and Community Development all know, and RMU know how the code proceeds and what application documents are coming in, what information we need to see. That is all going to be handled with staff, but that's not to say that either RMU's legal counsel or me as special counsel or a law firm won't ever review some of these applications. It depends on how complicated they are, especially with the zoning. It depends on what they're proposing to do, which kicks it on to the certain track. So that's kind of a key determination to make up front. As for who is going to be monitoring them when they're going out and putting these sorts of things, that'll be city staff. That'll, when they grant the permit, it'll have conditions, sort of, you have to follow the code. You can't overburden these things. You can't do something outside of what we've permitted you to do. So that sort of compliance is going to be on staff.
It sounds to me like you're asking for a lot more staff because the current staff has a job.
Sure.
Currently.
Mm-hmm.
And so you're asking for, and maybe I don't know, it's being shoved down their throat, I understand. Mm-hmm. But you're going to somebody's going to have to hire a lot more staff that's well trained to go through these, that understand what they're reading.
So that's kind of one of the big qualms that a lot of cities have with the passage of that legislation that's kind of making us do this, is they're severely limiting our fees that we can even charge for applications. If we don't respond, they're deemed approved within an X number of days, and that's, you know, something that we can't get around. I understand the concern, but it's something that kind of Jeff City has put on us rather than something that, you know, ideally we would have, you know, multiple months to review these things. They won't come 25 at a time and in every part of the city, but this is the case that they've represented both to Jefferson City and to Washington, D.C., that it needs to be, you know, all at once, and it's coming, and we can't do much about it. I do understand the concern, however, but it's probably better to have the ability to at least try to administratively limit what we can, rather than have a bunch of ones that we don't get to see or run shot clocks or not do anything.
So there's a good possibility there's going to be some things slip through the cracks that we will figure out later.
I'm not sure how you mean.
Well, that if all these applications come in at once,
Sure.
and there's not appropriate time to review all of them, some of them may not be quite correct.
Well, it's city staff goal and our firm's goal to make sure that that is either non-existent or minimized to the extent possible. Now, it's kind of a hypothetical, I guess, is my answer. May one slip through the cracks because, you know, an understaffing issue, or God forbids, you know, somebody gets really ill and that's the only person that reviews them. It could happen, but the goal is, at least internally, to be able to train and to try to prevent that to the maximum extent possible.
Any other questions?
Yes.
Kind of piggybacking off of him, if a application makes it through and it doesn't get through the approval process, it just gets deemed to be approved because nobody has the time to look at it. Is there some sort of time limit or review process down the road, should like RMU or the city determine that this antenna is not appropriate, or are we just stuck with the antenna?
So the way the law is written, so long as they're not violating ADA or materially interfering with the safe traffic operation, there's about 4 or 5 things, A through J, in the permitted uses of things that we would look for. But if they don't violate those, the way that the law is written seems to give them a license or a permit to be there theoretically indefinitely.
What if RMU says, well, we're taking down the pole?
That would, if it were RMU, that would probably be covered directly in their third-party agreement. That was something that'd be covered. As for like taking down a traffic light, it would no longer be a support structure, but they might try to move it to like an adjacent, you know, building or something like that. That I'm not 100% certain.
Okay. And then if consent isn't given for the application, so it's reviewed appropriately and the RMU or the city determines they're not going to issue an application, what is the appeal process?
It goes to the Board of Adjustment, I think, but I'm not sure they have the expertise to, I mean, I'm sure they can get trained for it, but I think it goes to the Board of Adjustment.
As currently
question
written.
I asked a while ago, but
Yes.
Yeah.
There is a process, so.
Yeah, there is a process that it does go to the BZA, and that, you know, would require staff to write a report about, you know, why the decisions were made, and that would just be kind of handed over to them to make the decision they made.
I'm sure work progress and be amended and updated periodically, so.
Well, as stated, the law does require that an ordinance be passed with these terms. That's part of either rush to get something on the books. That's not to say that there might not be things that will be fixed. I don't mean fixed, but things that were, things that don't work for the buyers that we could give a little bit on, or things that they don't really care that we can change. So yeah, I think that's a fair statement.
Are there any pre-filed bills with the legislature this session to change any of this?
That I'm not certain.
Any other questions, comments? Thank you, Mr.
Thank you.
Anything else, James, on your part?
Sure. Just to speak to the processing of multiple, if we did get an influx of applications, there's actually provision for that you can get one permit. You can have 20 co-locations with one permit. Also, the way that the application is formulated, it puts the burden of proof on the applicant, and I've been studying this, and I'm pretty sure we can get through anything that comes our way. I know that for a fact. Now, the community development department is not going to climb up poles and inspect them, but RMU actually there's the only basically in essence the only city-owned poles are streetlights. And so those, everything else, RMU is going to inspect them, and so is Public Works. So I don't see an issue there at all. Does that kind of help you out there? And then there's one. I know that there was some concern about, and I saw in the paper today, exceptions to AT&T, and I knew you wanted to talk to the lawyer about that. And I just wanted to see if you wanted to talk about the revisions we made in light of AT&T's concerns.
Sure. I didn't read the newspaper article, but it's been kind of represented to me that it seemed as if we were making kind of special concessions to AT&T. I can say that AT&T did provide certain comments, but those comments were not the only, they weren't, if we would have received comments from other carriers, they would have been considered. It's not a goal to set AT&T specific standards, as I discussed with the discrimination. We're trying to bring and clarify the playing field. So in no way was it intended to give them a leg up or to make them the preferred carrier or anything like that. They were changes that were reviewed that city staff was comfortable making, and agreed that there were certain things that could be clarified or work better for everybody. Because, like I said, there is a lot of ideally collaboration, because I think that's going to get us the best result, both avoiding a lawsuit, aesthetically, keeping this out of another bill being filed, changing the whole thing. That's kind of the hope, that we can all come together and come up with some small cell stuff that everybody will like and will get us the deployments we need. So,
good. Thank you.
Thank you.
Any other things to discuss or comments? If not, I'd entertain a motion.
Did we need to add these amendments on historical? You asked about amendments or something.
Proposed changes?
It's such a minor change. It's just adding 2 words. I was not informed that was needed. No, I don't think so. I don't think it's needed. Yeah.
The council can address that in their final ordinance anyway.
Yeah.
I think.
And I you know about it, so I think that's good enough. But if you do, I mean, you can. But
I make a motion, we send it to the city council with our approval.
You have a motion, do I have a second?
Second.
I have 2 seconds, you can take a pick. Any other final questions or comments?
Bowie,
Yes.
Crowell,
Yes.
Jordan,
Yes.
Martin,
Yes.
Schmidt,
Yes.
and Stevens Shields.
Yes.
The motion passes
Unanimously. Okay.
unanimously.
problem. The chairperson has nothing to report. We have no outstanding committees. Anything from staff to report? There's a lot going on in Rolla. They're tearing things down and putting things up.
Yeah. Been so busy with these revisions. There's some stuff happening, but nothing. Nope, we don't have any of these coming up.
Where they broke ground on St. Maria's or doing something. So,
There was
any comments from the citizens in the?
Chairman Brown, it has come to my attention, Mr. Hopgood, I think, would like to speak to the committee on because of Mr. Butts. There was an issue that he had at his home, and he said that there were ordinances regarding that, and so he suggested that he come to our meeting tonight and talk with us.
Is he here?
Yes.
Oh, well, please come forward then. Put this forward.
Hi, I'm Terry Hopgood, live at 605 Chester. Had a situation that occurred a couple weeks ago, and I went and talked to Mr. Butts about this, and I'll share it with you in just a minute, but he said there was no ordinance or city involvement. A house across the street from me, and I know that each side of the street has a right of way. Ameren was accessing a line to get gas across the street. So I get up one morning, I go out and dig a big hole in my yard. I've not been informed about any of this. No one had asked me about it. No one had suggested this was going to happen. It was not because there was a major problem. This was a planned event to occur. So I go out and begin to talk with them about it. Did you not let me know on my land that you're going to do this? No. Well, I guess we had to do that. Well, these were all subcontractors. Even the supervising engineer was a different company, was a subcontractor. No one from Ameren was even there. So I talked with them about that. I just put my yard in, and they said, well, when we get finished, we'll just fix it. I said, well, no, you won't fix it. My landscaper will fix it, and then you'll pay for it. And so went through this kind of stuff. So the next day I get up, and they have this piece of machinery. I also noticed that we're out in the same day, they were out in the middle of the street taking the manhole cover, going down inside there doing something. I don't know what they were doing. And so the next day, I have this piece of machinery that does traditional drilling. So they get on my property, not the easement, but into my property, damaging my land right there, the work I had done, to begin drilling under the street to access this property, across the street. And there was no one there to do anything except we're sorry. My wife and I both felt like we were just sort of stuck. The damage had been done, didn't know this was going to happen. And so anyway, I talked to Mr. Butts. I called his office, and they sent an engineer over. I'm not sure what his name was. But he came over. He knew nothing about this. And he said, in fact, that the day before he saw some people working in the street in the manhole cover and thought this was the city sewage or sewer people working doing something. He didn't know. And so I'm sitting here thinking, so these people can just come on my property, and John even told me up on my property that was trespassing. Well, I didn't know that or whatever. They just came in, and like I said, the damage was done. And so they come in, they do this, and they go under there, and I was sort of aghast that the city had no knowledge of this. There was no sense of having to get a permit, to have someone from the city to watch what's going on, because I don't know what to do in the street, that they can just come in. There's always this laissez-faire approach that they have this right to just come in and do this. So when talking to Mr. Butts, going back to one of the comments that was made earlier on this wireless communication policy that you're developing, that the money to have someone manage this and to look at this and to evaluate this maybe more than what the city has. It's just going to take more manpower to do this. But I found it very interesting that they come on, I did like 150 square feet, and they got within about 15 feet of my house with this piece of machinery. Between my property on the west side and the next piece of property, there's about a 15, 20-foot lease or leeway there that the city has. And I talked to the engineer I said, why didn't you just go over here and use this section, which belonged to the city, to do the work? He said, well, we didn't know it was there. I said, it's because you didn't talk to anyone. So I was pretty upset about the whole process, but more than that, just me, was the idea that people can just come on, these companies, these have monopolies, and do this type of work without acknowledging the landowner, that the city doesn't know anything about it. I talked with two people from Ameren, one from Columbia, one from Jeff City, and they said, well, we have these subcontractors, we can do this. We go down. They had their story in place. And I did make a comment to him that my landscaper will provide an invoice for you guys to pay for this. And he said, well, that's kind of hard for us to do in terms of how we do our policy stuff. And I said, well, you had no problem getting on my property to drill this under the street. So I just wanted, I don't know if you know about this or not, but I just thought it was pretty, I was just taken back by the whole thing, that they could do this and the city not even be aware of it. And so I just wanted to bring it, since you were dealing with this situation, and I was really interested in the fact of maintaining it. You know, who's going to watch this? They're just going to do it on their own? Unfortunately, I think sometimes we have to keep eyes on this stuff and not just let it happen because they have some sense of position or a monopoly that they can just come on and do it. So I'm not sure where it goes from here, but I just wanted somebody to be aware of it. John thought the Planning and Zoning Commission was the place, since you were dealing with this policy, and because it's not going to go away, it's going to keep growing, and we can lose control pretty quickly. Question, comment?
Did they, the reason they're on your property is the gas line? Is there an easement? Or where is the gas line run?
Well, the gas line is on my property in the easement. It goes right there next to the street on La Chateau. It goes right across there. So I know they have to access it, but there's still some sense of just let me know you're going to be doing this.
Did they do any painting of lines and all of that on the streets and that before they did it?
Not on the street. They did. I saw some painted lines across my property.
And because Diggerite's supposed to come out and mark everything before they do anything.
I think they did. I mean, I didn't know what they were going to do.
Right. You didn't have any idea, but I was wondering if they even
we just built our house, and so we're used to having lines and things happening. But again, it was the idea, and when I talked to people in Jeff City, they said, or Columbia, he said, well, we usually get a hold of you, of the person. And I said, well, it didn't happen in my case, and this was a significant deal. On top of that, I found out they were actually supposed to do the drilling from the other side of the street, not my side of the street. But there again, you know, Ameren's not present. Subcontractors, well, we're going to fix it, we're going to do A, B, C. I said, no, you're going to do what you're going to do. You're going to up and leave. And then I can't even fix my yard right now because of the weather. And so, I mean, I've taken pictures, I have video, I've done all the things I need to do, and I had the city come over, my landscaper come over, my builder come over, and witnesses to what was happening. And I just think for the city of Rolla in general, there needs to be some sensitivity to the landowner and then the process of how things are done. And some sort of checks and balances needs to occur, in my opinion. So that's what I have to say about that.
Any other questions for him?
I have a question for James or maybe Steve. You know, first of all, I guess, why don't we have something like this on the books to address this with code enforcement or some other ordinance? And if we don't have, and I'm assuming we don't, since he obviously has had these problems, is there some model that we can look to? Or are you aware of any ordinances that other cities might have to protect homeowners from similar intrusions?
It's just property rights. There's nothing that zoning and planning has to do.
Maybe not. I mean, part of it's a notice issue. If we're issuing permits to companies to come in and do this work, certainly I would think there would be some notice requirement.
Any type of utility work in the right-of-way or on an easement does not require a permit. So we wouldn't be privy to that information anyway. So again, if they're on the right-of-way or if they're in the easement, that is their right to have an easement. If they're on private property, that's a civil matter. That's trespassing. They actually get across the line. But yeah, but we have no type of permitting process in place for utilities.
So the bottom line here is that these subcontractors basically violated property rights, but because they went onto his property, but they would have been okay if they were in the right of way.
Yes. Again, it could be a civil issue, but we would definitely not get involved with that.
But they were on his property, not on.
We don't know all the facts of this, but if they were off of the easement or out of the right of way on his property, then yes, that's trespassing. That would be
So from the
issue.
curb back, how far is?
Depends where his property line is. We don't go by curbs. We go by property lines.
You can only know your property line by a survey.
We expect homeowners to maintain the right of way, and in a situation like this where a company, maybe they don't have to have any permits or get any permissions if it's in the right of way, but they certainly did, sounds like, significant damage to property that we expect landowners, property owners to maintain. Is there any protection in that regard? If it sounds like he probably has a nice yard, they come in and tear it up.
I ran into myself. I had just finished putting a new 5-strand barbed wire fence on my farm, and I had a utility easement for some power poles. Opening morning deer season 5 years ago, a subcontractor came in for the utility company and decided to replace them poles opening morning. Cut ruts all the way down through my field. They're yet today to be fixed. I kind of fixed them, but that was their right. They was on their easement, and I had impeded their path to their easement, putting that new fence up. So they did patch the fence in, but they wouldn't have had to. And again, I'm not an attorney. But,
I'm just curious, is there a way for the city to help protect against that, since we do require landowners to maintain these areas?
Yes, and that's another one that we have pushed back a lot too, because yes, they don't own that property. It is the right of way, but they're required to maintain it through an ordinance. I don't know. We'd have to maybe sit down and talk with city council and see if there's an ordinance or something that could be drafted to where the utility companies or would have to notify property owners. But that again, I'd have to refer to you to talk to council on that. I wouldn't be.
So the explanation that he didn't know that the easement was 15 feet to the right, that he should have been on to do this work, and he didn't know about it, why is that? And you're telling me it's their right, that the easement is there. The only way you know that the easement is there is by property line, so I'm assuming that it's on their...
They should have, yes, they should have known where, and again, it makes sense that if that contractor's coming out and doing the work on the easement, they should know where that easement is, yes.
But it's still a civil case, not a...
That's right, it still would be a civil case.
I mean, it's not unique to Rolla. Someone tore down the wrong house in St. Louis, and some roofer put half a roof on the wrong house here in Rolla, so you end up putting the other half on. I mean, stuff happens, so, but it's still a civil. I don't know what you could draft. I don't know what.
Again, that's why I would refer you to.
P&Z could do it. I'd say the city attorney.
Well, it seems like the biggest issue is notice. First of all, I mean, the failure of this company to give notice, because obviously, if he'd known about it in advance, at least it wouldn't be a shock. And I think most people prefer to get notice. And then the second issue I see is really, as it relates at least to the right-of-way, that they should be required to put it back into the condition in which they found it. I don't think that's asking too much when we have an ordinance telling our property owners that you have to maintain it. But if some company comes in and tears it up, well, no big deal. You still have to maintain it. I mean, it's ridiculous. I think we should be able to say to these companies, yes, you have a right-of-way. Yes, you can access your easement. We're not going to restrict that because you need to be able to do it. But when you do it, you got to return it to the way you found it.
And that may be, but again, I wouldn't feel comfortable answering that question or saying that our department can draft up an ordinance that says that. I think that would have to be put in front of the city council in order.
Yeah,
Did you not say that they were going to put it back into the condition it was?
We will fix it. I said, well, you're not allowed.
Right. No, I totally understand, but I just was wondering what their answer was.
I guess they fixed mine too. I went back and did it.
But I was also concerned about them going under the street without any supervision. Some young man up the street was, in his truck. And I didn't know about a safety issue as well.
Yeah. They did the same thing in our neighborhood last year, exactly the same, except for the fact that I don't think they got on private property. They were on the easement, and they dug it across. They somewhat put it back in shape. They leveled it off and threw some grass seed on it, like you said, and that's about all they did. So I was just wondering what their answer to you was on that.
My property, that's a civil issue.
Oh, I totally agree with you there.
But again, on the other side of the street, and again, and I've already come the day before, and so I just felt like there was just absolutely no control. We were just out there by ourselves, and I'm not the only one that's going to experience this, as you can see. Things are going to happen. So I just don't want to just ignore it.
I was a little concerned with the fact that there were people in the manholes that are not employees of the city of Rolla, and no one seemed to know that they were in the manhole. And I'm sitting here thinking, so what would a terrorist do if they just walked in, took up the manhole, and got in and did what they needed to do? I mean, I was a little concerned with the fact that there just seems to be no, as Mr. Hopgood said, no communication about who's doing what, when, and where.
Well, I would imagine the reason they was in the manhole, I can't answer for them, was to get some sort of an elevation if they was doing directional drilling so they wouldn't hit that sewer line. But again, that's, I can't answer that.
Of our pay grade, I think. So, any other comments? Good luck with it, Mr. Hopgood. I'm not sure. I'm sure Mr. Butts gave you good direction, but I'm not sure we have an answer for you. So, but we'll look into it and ask staff to look into it. So, any other comments from people in the audience? Hearing none, we're adjourned.
What do you need me to do?
Well, you are. Oh, sorry about that.
Oh, well.
Have a good week.
I'd have been better off staying at home and going to the game.
Good luck.